This video is going to be something a bit quieter and more meandering. I've been moving in a slower rhythm lately, well, slower than usual, really. Fatigue has been weighing extra heavily on me, so I've just been filming a little bit here and there as I work on a few projects. There isn't really an overarching theme to this video, and honestly, there hasn't been much of one to my days lately either, so I'm not going to try to make things seem more than they are. I'm just going to embrace the slowness and work with what I've got. So this is a small glimpse into how things have been going and the kinds of projects I've had on my needles. The first thing I've been working on, or rather have finished, are these socks. I finished them about a week ago. They're a gift knit for my sister, and even though I started her gifts a bit late, or maybe very late, I did manage to finish one sock in time for Christmas, so at least she got a preview of what was coming. At this point, all that's left is weaving in one last end. Unfortunately, I ran into 2 knots in the same skein of yarn for this last sock, which meant cutting and rejoining twice, and 4 extra ends to deal with. I find that weaving in ends on socks can be a little bit tedious, partially just because it's such a small gauge, and I feel like I barely know what I'm looking at. Hopefully the ends won't be noticeable when the socks are worn, but I think it's certainly better than having knots right in the middle of the foot. Once that's done, I can block the second sock like the first, and finally give my sister her completed gift sometime before January is done. I am glad they're finished, not because I didn't enjoy knitting them, but because I always love that moment of seeing a project fully realized after so much time and effort went into it. Toward the end of a project, I tend to feel a lot of anticipation like that, but then almost immediately after it's done, my brain switches right back into creating mode. These socks are knit in a pine green sock yarn, and although they have a lace pattern, it was fairly easy for me to memorize, which I think is saying something, considering the amount of brain fog I deal with day to day. I only made one noticeable mistake right where I started the gusset decreases. I must have mixed up the start of the lace pattern. You can see the columns of lace shift slightly to the side. Thankfully, this happens right where the foot meets the ankle, so it isn't actually very obvious once they're worn, if it's obvious at all. And besides, I firmly believe that every project needs at least one small mistake to appease the fiber gods. This is another project I've been working on, and it's very much still in progress. It's also a gift knit, this time for my mom. I had a couple of skeins of this deep blue yarn sitting in my stash for quite a while without a clear purpose. I originally bought them just to get a feel for the yarn before committing to a larger project. That's something I end up doing fairly often since I don't have easy access to yarn shops with a wide selection where I live. The result is that I tend to accumulate single or double skeins that then need a project assigned to them, something I find a lot harder than choosing yarn for a specific pattern. And then when you add my patented indecision to the mix, I end up with quite a few odd amounts of yarn waiting their turn for a project. But I finally did decide on a project for this yarn, and I'm making a small scarf for my mom. The pattern that I'm using for the scarf is called Riptide 135, by Jennifer Shiels Toland, which can be found on Ravelry. It alternates columns of lace with stockinette, which I find pretty but not overly complicated. I had tried a more heavily textured pattern with this yarn before, and I didn't love the result, so this feels like a much better balance. Just like the socks for my sister, I only finished part of this scarf before Christmas, and then just handed it over, needles and all, to my mom. But that actually worked out well because I was able to get her input on the length before finishing it. So instead of the double wrap scarf that is shown in the pattern, I'm going to knit this to wrap just once around the neck. When I was first starting with the scarf, I could only knit in short bursts, probably due to some combination of fatigue and brain fog and having to look at the pattern constantly because I hadn't memorized the lace pattern yet. And it did take me a while to memorize, but once I did reach the point where I no longer had to look at the pattern constantly, I did settle into a really nice rhythm with it. And now I find it quite a relaxing knit, actually. It doesn't require too much of my brain energy, but it's still engaging. Now I just need to knit until I'm about 4 or 5 inches short of the length that I want the finished scarf to be, and then I can start the decrease section to form the second point of the scarf. Of course, I can't only have 2 works in progress going at a time. I don't even only have 3, but these 3 are the ones that I've been focusing on lately. In between gift knitting, I wanted something just for myself, something to switch to when my brain needed a change. I've realized I could use a few more hand-knit hats in my wardrobe. Beanies tend to make me look a little bit like an egg, and I also need something that actually keeps my ears warm when I'm outside in the winter. This pattern I'm making is a modern take on the turban-style headwear that was popular around the 1940s. And it's very simple, which I appreciate. So far, it's just a long strip of 1x1 ribbing, endless ribbing really, but I've been enjoying it as a small, straightforward knit. It's a nice contrast to the lace-heavy socks and scarf that I've been doing. From my quick skim of the pattern, the construction does look really interesting. It starts as this long band of ribbing, and then somehow transforms into a 3-dimensional piece of headwear. I don't fully understand how it's all going to come together yet, but I'll cross that bridge when I get there. The ribbing itself is working up into a very squishy fabric, which feels almost double thick, so it should be nice and warm, which I know my ears will definitely appreciate. I also have to mention the yarn. This is Barocco Ultra Wool DK in the color Rosemary. It's a green with subtle but noticeable heathering, and I really like it so far. I'm drawn to greens in general, but this one leans slightly more yellow rather than blue, which feels kind of refreshing to me after using so many blues and blue-greens lately. I feel like my Ravelry project page is a complete sea of blue and bluish-green or greenish-blue. So it's nice and refreshing, and at least a slight change from that. Barocco Ultra Wool in the worsted weight version was actually the first yarn that I ever knit with when I was teaching myself how to knit back in November of 2023. so it does have a bit of nostalgic value for me for that reason. I haven't finished a project with either the worsted or the DK versions yet, so I'm curious to see how this holds up with wear over time. Of course, my life isn't only knitting and fiber arts, but chronic illness does mean my world is fairly small. I often still carry the mindset of someone much more able-bodied than I am now, and that makes it easy to feel like what I do in a day isn't quote-unquote enough, or that it doesn't really count. I know logically that productivity is not a measure of worth, but it can still be difficult to fully take that to heart. Lately, I've been trying to pay more attention to the smaller things I do throughout the day, to notice them rather than just let them pass over. In a way, they exist in the same rhythm as my knitting or spinning. My houseplants are maybe a good example. They're gratefully low maintenance, but they still need sunlight and water from time to time. Even though watering them takes energy, something I have a very limited supply of, I often find the process calming. It's kind of like a small, quiet ritual. Something simple that still feels like care and kind of like participation in the world, even on slow days. In the evenings, I often like to spend a little time spinning on my wheel before bed. The repetition of treadling and drafting feels meditative to me sometimes. When I'm working with a familiar fiber and drafting style, it's something I can sink into without it demanding much mental energy. What I'm spinning now is my second spinning project, and unlike the first one, I've planned this one out a little bit more. I'm working with a very large 40-ounce bag of fiber, which I think will give me a lot of flexibility in what I can make. I'm aiming to spin enough yarn for a sweater or a cardigan, hopefully, though I haven't settled on one specific pattern yet. I have a few in mind that should work well with the yarn I'm trying to make, though. I'm aiming for something around a sport weight, and planning to do a 3-ply for the first time. My first spin was technically a 3-ply, but it was a chain ply, so it behaves differently. I'm interested in seeing how the 3-ply really evens out the consistency of my singles. Right now my singles are averaging about 35 wraps per inch, which hopefully should be just about right for the sport weight that I'm aiming for. Consistency is always the real challenge though, so we'll see how well I manage it. I'm trying not to put too much weight into it or to be too concerned by a perfect outcome. After all, this is a hobby that I do for fun, for enjoyment, and because it has the capacity to be relaxing if I only allow it to be. Like my first project, I'm using a merino wool top, but this time it is lightly variegated with 3 or 4 different shades of blue. My first garment spin suffered a bit from quite over-twisted singles that caused it to feel a little bit ropey and a little bit wiry, so I'm trying to be more mindful of that this time. But it's a fine line between too much and too little twist, and I've definitely snapped the single more than once, including while filming this, which maybe that was the universe just providing me with an excellent example to show all of you. I am slowly getting a better feel for it. Counting my drafting movements along with my treadling speed does help, and eventually it stops being something I have to consciously track and turns into a rhythm instead. I think being a musician helps a little bit here. Once it clicks, it does really start to feel like muscle memory. And that's kind of one of my favorite parts of spinning, when you reach that point where you don't have to consciously think as much, and the movement kind of continues to carry itself. So that's where things are for me right now. Nothing especially polished or, I suppose, impressive happening. Just a few projects, a slower rhythm, and just taking things as they come. Thank you for deciding to spend a little bit of your time with me, and I hope this video felt nice to sit with wherever you're watching from. Until next time, I'll probably just keep moving at this pace, working on what I can, and hopefully letting that be enough.